Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in to this video, which has been a long time coming. I initially wanted to discuss this story in January, and then I got cold feet and decided it would be better to wait, and then other delays came along. I still don't know how I feel about posting this, but 6 months later, here we are. I'm going to give it a try. Today, I would like to take a few minutes to discuss A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, published in 1859, his second-to-last novel. It is a classic work of historical fiction about the French Revolution, from the seeds of discontent before the Revolution to the peak of the Reign of Terror, as told from the perspectives of various characters, some French, some English. I read this book, this exact Barnes & Noble Classics paperback edition, the first time when I was 14 years old. I got really into Dickens when I was in 8th grade. I did an oral report on him. I printed pictures, illustrations from his various books, and stuck them, made a collage with them. That was my visual aid, and I read excerpts from a couple of his books, which really bored my classmates. I remember my English teacher was impressed when she saw I was reading it. And rereading it all these years later, and being startled by how dense the writing is, rich but dense, I have to imagine she wondered how much of the content I was able to understand. I do think there was a lot I missed, although the language and the style weren't so foreign to me since I was reading a lot more classics at that time than I am these days, to my embarrassment. A lot of the allusions and the depth likely went over my head. Still, I understood what I could, and that was enough to come away from it feeling conflicted about the French Revolution, and enough to fall in love with the book's anti-hero, Sidney Carton, who became a lifelong literary crush. I'd say I wasn't completely ignorant of the history either. I was very familiar with the 1982 film The Scarlet Pimpernel, with its heroic deeds and political intrigue as an English nobleman seeks to rescue innocent people from la guillotine. While Dickens covers that same dark period and alludes to its coming from page 1, though, the story doesn't get there until the second half of the book. The narrative deals with the doctor, Dr. Manette, wrongfully imprisoned for years at the Bastille, his faithful and angelic daughter Lucy, who restores his mental and physical health, and becomes the object of affection for two men, one Charles Darnay, a Frenchman who has renounced his noble name and title and fled to England, the other, Sidney Carton, a legal advocate held back from a prosperous career by his alcoholism. Meanwhile, there's strife in France, the poor and downtrodden lower classes, having suffered too long from starvation and abuse, rising up against their oppressors. Generally speaking, it's a story about the French Revolution, but at its core, it is about revenge, sacrifice, and redemption. It had been years since I read this book, and while there are scenes that have stayed with me all this time, and while I've watched a few film adaptations, one of them quite a lot, in the interim, I'd forgotten how exactly Dickens handles the subject of the Revolution. It's a controversial topic, seen by some as a necessary shakeup of the old social and economic order, an upheaval of the status quo that led to great advances in freedom and democracy. But there's the other side of it, the Reign of Terror. The French Revolution spanned from 1789 to 1799. The terror lasted for a much shorter time, September 5th, 1793 to July 28th, 1794. It's just under 11 months. But it was one of the most nightmarish periods of history. I wondered if Dickens, being an Englishman, might show bias against the French. After all, the two countries have had a centuries-old animosity, though I think things are better now. And Dickens did include a few unsavory French characters in previous novels. but he seems to have made a concerted effort to portray the French fairly here. His author's note describes his research and his avid attempt to maintain historical accuracy with regard to the French people. And indeed, with Dickens being such an outspoken advocate for the poor and destitute of England, it's not such a surprise that his portrayal of the poor and destitute of France should be similarly sympathetic. Dickens opens the book with one of the most famous first lines ever written. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and so on. It's a quotation in line with Hamlet's to be or not to be speech that you could memorize to sound smart and bore your friends at parties, but I wouldn't recommend it, and I haven't done that. With this lengthy first sentence, Dickens is introducing us to a society of extremes, where polar opposites exist contiguously, where deep chasms divide people economically, intellectually, philosophically, etc. And what is the highest pinnacle for some is inevitably the lowest valley for others. Dickens is speaking of time past, yet he points out, in the second sentence, that it's not so different from the present. His present. It's not so different from our present either. This passage, this opening paragraph, contains the sting of recognizable truth. In our society, this simultaneous best of times, worst of times, has more to do with politics, which I'm not going to discuss. This balance of extremes also introduces the novel's various dichotomies and the pairing of opposites, like London and Paris, Stryker and Carton, Carton and Darnay, Pross and Defarge. The entire first chapter, though, beyond just the opening sentence, is great. It's laying out the time and place, unveiling a unique scene that's ripe for conflict. Dickens' omniscient narrator knows the future downward trajectory, and thus is speaking in hindsight, his foreboding imagery foreshadowing the construction of the guillotine and the tumbrils that will carry the condemned to their deaths. As dark and heavy as it gets, though, A Tale of Two Cities is not devoid of Dickens' signature wit and quirky comic relief. For instance, I love the humorous description of Tellson's bank, especially the part about any young employees being kept hidden away in the back until they've gotten old enough to be displayed out front with the other ancient bankers. The first half of the chapter, Monseigneur in Town, is scathing in its sarcastic picture of the excesses of the aristocracy. Stryker is not a likable character, but he provides a welcome dash of levity, as does Jerry Cruncher, whose secret side gig I can't believe I forgot about. And there's also Miss Pross, who is a delightful character with all the appearance of rigidity, hiding a soft heart and a fierce loyalty. And I had to laugh at the mental image of Miss Pross and Jerry Cruncher, who are both so very English, going shopping together in revolutionary France. It's called The Tale of Two Cities. While I'd argue that it feels like it focuses primarily on Paris, there is sufficient time spent in London as well, and Dickens shows that city to be a bit of a powder keg too. For example, there are the bloodthirsty spectators at Charles Darnay's trial, or later there's the riotous mob that turns the spy's funeral into a parade, ousting the mourner and the undertakers and carrying the coffin away. The mob then starts accusing random passersby, The mob then starts accusing random passersby of being spies, getting violent, breaking windows, and plundering businesses. Full anarchy would break out if not for the threat of the guards. That's nothing, of course, to what develops in France. Dickens takes his time with a gradual build-up. The turning point is the chapter titled Echoing Footsteps, about the storming of the Bastille. I had trouble getting through this chapter when I was younger. I don't think I knew about the event, and I couldn't fully grasp all that was happening. Now, I get it. Plus, I can appreciate how Dickens changes his writing to reflect the action. Sentences are shorter, more abrupt, and structure reflects movement, chaos, and the push forward. And then there's that first shocking act of retribution. Madame Defarge cutting off the beaten and stabbed prison governor's head and putting it up for display. Madame Defarge is the book's central antagonist and one of Dickens' most famous characters. She's a wine merchant's wife who has a long-standing vendetta against an aristocratic family. We meet her husband first, but like Lady Macbeth, she's the one wearing the pants. Defarge admires her, and Defarge himself believes in the cause and is willing to go all the way, but there are some things that he's a little unsure about, and she scorns her husband's potential weakness and any sentiment he expresses. I do feel that the early Defarge chapters are a little weak, writing-wise. The dialogue is supposed to be French translated into English, and it can sound stilted and awkward. Plus, Dickens doesn't tell you a whole lot about what the Defarges and their men are up to. You can figure it out yourself, and there's information you learn later that can fill in the blanks, but it might take a while to get there. And I'm sure a lot of first-timers have said, "What's with all the guys named Jacques?" And I probably should point out that Dickens is operating under the assumption that his reader is familiar with the French Revolution and its infamous imagery and knows what's coming. So he drops frequent references to things that show up later. He's kind of winking at the audience, but it's not that cheerful. So because of that, I would say maybe you don't want to just dive into the book if you don't know anything about the French Revolution, or especially the Reign of Terror, because there will be some things that you miss out on, and it might be confusing. In a similar, not-so-obvious fashion, the book's hero, or anti-hero, is quietly introduced. Just one of several characters in a scene, standing there with his hands in his pockets, staring up at the ceiling as if he's not paying any attention to what's happening. There's no sign pointing at him and saying, "This is the main character!" The reader's left to read between the lines, and if you aren't familiar with the plot, it's very likely you won't pick up on Dickens' hints. The presentation is very unconventional, but it's kind of an unconventional book. Dickens changes tense, he changes viewpoints, he changes from third person to first person. This was his second to last book. By this stage in his career, he'd figured out he could basically do whatever he wanted. We'll get to that part all in good time, though. I wasn't done with Madame Defarge. Having done a little of my own research, I found that Dickens was more generous with Madame Defarge than the actual leaders of the Revolution might have been. The truth is that many of the revolutionaries who took control did not want women in equal positions of power. Not that Madame Defarge participates in political assembly, but she is a powerful woman with followers. So-called market women did play an important role in the revolution prior to the Reign of Terror. Thousands of women gathered and marched to the Palace of Versailles in October 1789, making demands for bread, which were eventually met. This successful event made waves, and as a group, they became strong leaders and participants in the revolution. However, when the Terror began, they were outlawed from any political assembly. French feminist writer Olympe de Gouges was executed as a warning to other women with similar ambitions that female activity in the political arena was not welcome. Forbidden from further active involvement, they instead took to gathering around the guillotine with their knitting, watching and cheering the executions, and there you have the famous tricoteuses, the knitting women. Dickens doesn't go into any of this, but the tricoteuses are there, Madame Defarge and her crazy, bloodthirsty, sycophant friend, the Vengeance, among them. Actually, Dickens kind of goes one better. From our first introduction to Madame Defarge, she is knitting. Always knitting. And we learn that what she's knitting is a register in code of the names of those who will eventually fall prey to the guillotine. It's creepy. We come to know more about Madame Defarge bit by bit, and we only find out what's really driving her near the end of the book. She is determined and devoted to the cause, and her husband is right to be cautious about speaking his mind, because I have no doubt that she would denounce him. There's a chilling conversation in the wine shop between Madame Defarge and her cronies, the Vengeance and Jacques III, where she utters the famous line, "Tell the wind and fire when to stop, but not me." Madame Defarge is a character who believes in the Reign of Terror wholeheartedly. It is right and just in her eyes when the tables have finally turned to crush your former oppressors, to kill them and all connected with them, and to show them no compassion or mercy. No mercy was shown to us, therefore no mercy shall be shown to them. And what's more, she is so into it that I think she'd gladly let herself be sent to the guillotine if at any point she relented or showed weakness. She's an impassioned fighter and a leader, and she's a terrifying person, but I'll give her this, she is not a hypocrite. I don't know if you've picked up on this yet, but I feel pretty strongly about the Reign of Terror. The French Revolution, I don't know, I'm conflicted, especially as an American, knowing how our revolution and our Declaration of Independence helped inspire it. There are good things that came of it, but I have an issue with viewing it as a wholly positive event and glossing over the bad part. You can't excuse it as the birth pains of democracy. Yeah, things were crazy for a time there, but it all evened out. No, that's not an excuse for murder, for revenge killings. Were some of the aristocrats horrible people? Absolutely. Did they do cruel, demeaning things to the poor? Yes. Does that justify rounding them up, subjecting them to a joke of a trial, and chopping off their heads in front of a crazed crowd? I don't think so. I don't think anything justifies that. And we're not talking about a few dozen ultra-rich pampered people here. Over 10,000 people were executed, and another 10,000 are estimated to have died in prison. In less than a year. Change was needed in France, but the ones who seized control went way too far. It wasn't a time of liberation, welcoming the free exchange of contrasting ideas. It was a time of political intimidation and questionable loyalty, characterized by the influence of radical groups. So many radical groups, like the Jacobins, founded by Robespierre, who also instituted the Committee of Public Safety, from which there was no safety. And then there's the irony of the whole thing, that these increasingly radical groups ended up denouncing each other and exterminating each other. Starting, I think, with the Girondins. I don't know, I can't speak French, so these guys, a major group in the revolution, but they didn't like it when things got out of control, and the terror began when the bulk of them were executed, as were many members of this group, and this group, and this group. Very radical chief concerns were de-Christianization and increased executions. They wanted more death, more violence, more bloodshed, and they ended up getting their own heads chopped off. And then Robespierre and company were put down, and that's how things went. Things petered out, partly because the people got bored with watching executions every day, and partly because all the insane radical groups dissolved as their members were killed. It's the craziest twist that most of the revolutionary leaders, many of them well-educated, youngish men, late 20s, early 30s, were themselves executed in the last days of the Reign of Terror that they themselves had promoted. Curiously, Dickens never mentions Robespierre or any of the radical, ruthless younger generation of lawyers and journalists. None of the real historical figures are referred to by name, in fact. I don't know why he made that decision. Instead, he makes it seem like the Defarges and people like them are the ones devising all the plans and carrying out the revolution, which doesn't seem likely to me. But Dickens does allude to the eventual downfall of these men, using fictional individuals to stand in for the real ones in Sidney Carton's prophecy. I want to reiterate that Dickens does not blame the poor. They're treated with pity, while he spares little sympathy for the cruel aristocrats. That said, while the terror sprung from the corruption of absolute power, evil men taking advantage of the vacuum of leadership, the lower-class citizens, the sans-culottes, were also whipped up into a violent fury, pushed beyond what they could stand, too hungry, too tired, and too broken to take any more. The problem is that these people ended up being used and manipulated by their vindictive leaders. The character described as the mender of roads is the impressionable fool, easy prey for anyone who wants to make trouble, because he'll get caught up in the fervor of whatever crowd he's in. And Dickens plainly shows the fickleness of the crowd, 1 second cheering and crying to save the prisoner whose head it was demanding just a few days ago. The common denominator of the volatile mob from one day to the next is their violent enthusiasm, which in turn leads to enthusiastic violence. It occurs to no one to think, wait a minute, what are we yelling for? This doesn't make sense, because the mob doesn't encourage independent thought. I stayed up late one night early this year, reading about the Reign of Terror, its promoters and its victims, and just the absolute madness of the whole thing. That's a fun activity. You should try it sometime. The scariest thing is that we're a hop, skip, and a jump away from a situation like this. The world is on the precipice of something like this happening again, and in some ways, it already is happening. Personally, I want no part of any government or organization that calls for the denunciation of family and friends, that says that the best way to show your loyalty to the state or to the cause is to betray someone you care about or to inflict violence on someone. No cause is worthy if it demands you make that kind of sacrifice in the name of patriotism or activism. The famous refrain associated with the revolution is liberté, égalité, fraternité, but as printed here, it's liberty, equality, and brotherhood or death, which I take to mean liberty, equality, and brotherhood for everyone in agreement with us, and anyone who questions our authority, our actions, or our ideology is an enemy who we need to throw in prison or execute. The concept of taking away the basic rights of a certain class or category of citizens of a particular religion or race, perhaps, should be abhorrent to any sane society, as should the notion that it's okay to exterminate an entire group of individuals, to sentence them to death wholesale just because their beliefs are not in line with the prevailing power. Maybe I feel so strongly about this subject because I am so aware of the growing potential for it happening again. It might also have something to do with my reading A Tale of Two Cities when I was so young and forming an attachment to its chief character who suffers the most and the most unfairly, but does so with the utmost grace. Sidney Carton is an unlikely hero, a tragic figure of wasted potential. Intelligent, quick-thinking, young, handsome, a gentleman, but nobody is able to see that when he's drunk and cynical all the time. He is a picture of youth and promise wasted by dissipation, and depression brought on by that dissipation. The last act belongs to him. Other characters reflect, then or later, on his transfiguration, the change in his voice and his look, a light in his eyes born of newfound purpose, the selfless desire to do a good service for a loved one, the hope of being able to save a life by laying down his own, and thereby keeping an old promise. It can't be denied that there is a spiritual component here. Biblical references abound. The book opens with the phrase recalled to life, and resurrection and regeneration are themes throughout. But the central redemptive arc is Sidney's. The night his plan comes to him, he pours his last drink out on the fire and goes for a walk, reflecting repeatedly on John 11:25 and 26, and he emerges from that night a new man. From that point on, he becomes someone I'm not drawn to just because I feel sympathy for him and his angsty, broken heart, but because he transforms into a man of strength and action, the type character I admire, someone alert and quick, who rises to the occasion and defies everyone's expectations. His steadiness and bravery prove that what others surmised about his potential for greatness was not wrong, and I'm further impressed by his confidence, his self-control, his peaceful acceptance of what's coming, and his kindness and gentleness to the little seamstress whose hand he holds right up to the end. At last, he reveals that he's a good man with a warm heart, so much more than what he appeared to be. As might be expected, some of my favorite parts of the book are scenes that he appears in. The chapter A Fellow of No Delicacy, where Sidney tells Lucy of his feelings, is surprisingly emotional and frank. The fireside conversation between Sidney and Jarvis Lorry is so moving and so revealing for both of them, and the following pages where Sidney walks around the city at night are almost more poetry than prose. On a lighter note, one of the only things I find hard to swallow is the revelation of Barsad's true identity. What a coincidence! I know Dickens liked these coincidences and long-lost so-and-so reveals. It was a Victorian thing, but this one's so silly because I don't think it's even necessary. Dickens could have accomplished his purpose, I think, without that twist. However, that reveal does come hand in hand with Sidney's return to the story after an absence of 100 pages or so, and he's the one who makes the connection, and he pops back into the narrative out of the blue, and it's like, yes! Here he comes to save the day! Of course, it's a bittersweet reunion, because I know how the book ends. But when you love a character, you're excited when they reappear, no matter what. Another awesome scene, though, is the standoff between Miss Pross and Madame Defarge. What a great matchup of two strong, fierce characters, one driven by hate, the other driven by love. I certainly recommend this book. I give it top marks, even if there are one or two things that, if I were Dickens, I would have done a little differently. It's not light reading. It does require concentration, and if you've never read Dickens before, you should be forewarned that it requires some adjusting, and sentences tend to be long, and punctuation can be unusual. But it's worth it. It's one of the most powerful stories ever written. To wrap this up, I'll say just a few things about some adaptations. I've seen the 1935 film many times. It has a wonderful supporting cast and stars Ronald Colman, one of my favorites, as Sidney Carton, giving one of his best performances. This was the first Ronald Colman movie I ever saw, a few years after reading the book. I haven't reviewed it yet, but I did talk about it in the video, my 5 favorite Ronald Colman movies, and then some. I've seen the 1958 film, which stars Dirk Bogarde as Sidney Carton, also a very good performance. I believe I did a mini review of that film. Same with the 1980 TV movie, which also has a great supporting cast and does a unique thing by having star Chris Sarandon play both Sidney Carton and Charles Darnay. There should be links to these videos in the description. There are some other versions, including one from 1989 that stars James Wilby, but I haven't seen those. There are also at least 3 musical adaptations that I'm aware of. One is The Jackal, a hard-to-find rock opera by Desmond J. Flannery that I heard samples of years ago, and I really liked, and I've always wanted to listen to the whole thing. The second is a musical called Two Cities, written by Jeff Wayne, that I only recently learned about when I listened to Jeff Wayne's adaptation of The War of the Worlds. And third is A Tale of Two Cities, written by Jill Santoriello, which I think has been the most successful of these musical versions of A Tale of Two Cities. There have also been various retellings written over the years. I read one, and I think that was enough for me. It was a young adult dystopian retelling of A Tale of Two Cities, which I wasn't too crazy about. This was around the time that the young adult dystopian phenomena was just booming, and I guess it wasn't that memorable because I can't remember anything else about it. Okay, that's it. Yikes. This was a long video. I've had this topic on my mind for some time and wanted to get it all out there once and for all. If I was going to review A Tale of Two Cities, I wanted to do it thoroughly. And so I really appreciate those of you who have stuck around through the whole thing. Next week, I'll be back to business as usual. I do expect I will review the 1935 film in full at some point in the next... before the end of the year, let's say that, just because I've always been itching to do a full review of it, and I rewatched a good deal of it in January, and there's a lot more that I'd like to talk about besides Ronald Colman's performance. If you have read A Tale of Two Cities, I would love to hear your thoughts on it, so please feel free to discuss the book in the comments below. I look forward to reading what you have to say, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.